Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm elected to public office because I wanted to fight climate change. I first was elected to local government in 2002 to fight a natural gas pipeline through the Southern Salish Sea and a natural gas generating station that was going to be built by BC Hydro, very close to my home, and that got me into elected office. I later became chair of Islands Trust Council, which is a local government with a conservation mandate put in place by the NDP Barrett government in 1974 to preserve and protect. That took us into climate change. Living on islands, as I do, we saw the effect of climate change, whether it was drought, whether it was impacts on aquaculture, ocean acidification, affecting jobs in aquaculture. The imperative was real. And then the Harper conservative dark decade really motivated us on the West Coast. The way for us to beat the Kinder Morgan pipeline, the way to take bold action on climate change was to defeat the Conservatives. And here I find myself, thanks to the good people of Nanaimo Ladysmith. But my goodness, I am sad that we are still so far behind. I recognize climate change is the long emergency, and I recognize this in local government too. It was the most important thing we were going to do, but when the advocate from the homeless shelter came to the meeting, they were the one that had the most urgent action, and so it would slide to the background, even though we were all good people with the intention to take real meaningful action on climate change. And here we find ourselves, this country with all of its resources, its abundance, still we are not doing our share, and still even this government, this Liberal government with the best intentions, still has the same targets on climate change as the Harper Conservatives did. They talk a good line, but we have not taken the imperative we need, and certainly the call to action from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just last week certainly proclaims that alarm. This is a deep emergency. It's an emergency right now. BC was on fire this summer. The Prime Minister brought his cabinet to my riding, and the smoke was so thick in the air, people could not see from climate change caused wildfires. It's all around us, and it's something I hear every day now from my constituents. So the report released last week pooled more than 6,000 scientific reports. It confirmed we are already experiencing the impacts of climate change and that we must take action right now, deep cuts in order to have the worst, most devastating impacts to ecosystems, to our way of life. Canada's been buffered from this. Ocean currents have kept our air a little bit cooler even while the climate is continuing to heat. When those currents are not in their same pattern, we will get a double whammy. We have not experienced climate refugees the way that other countries have, a desertification. We've been buffered, but because of the abundance of our natural resources. But it is upon us, and surely this is the time for us to take deep action. The co-chair of the IPC working group, Jim Skay, noted that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is possible within the laws of chemistry and physics, but doing so would require unprecedented changes. And let me say from my position, Jagmeet Singh has asked me to be the women's equality critic for the NDP. We hear particularly around the world that women, elders, vulnerable people, people in poverty are the most susceptible on the human side to climate change. But we see this right in our community and right in our own country, not just from an international perspective where, you think of the women have to travel further to carry water back to their village. That is both hard on them physically and takes away from other opportunities, but it also exposes them to great danger, rape. And we've heard a lot about this through Parliamericas and some of the other international parliamentary associations. But it happens in Canada too. There are NGOs have been doing studies on this. In Toronto, the heat wave shelters are disproportionately used by women because they are the lower income earners. They are the ones that either are in apartment buildings with no air conditioning and they don't have the negotiating power with the bad landlord. They suffer particularly from extreme heat. They also are more likely to live in basement apartments where flooding, which happens in a city like Toronto, it hits them more. Then the study was, what are the climate change solutions offered by the City of Toronto? Their renovation rebates. That only applies to people who are homeowners, which again tends more to be men because of income disparities in our country. So just, even with our collective commitment to gender equality and fairness, climate action is good for women too. Salmon cannot go upstream to spawn if the water temperature is too hot. This is a big issue in British Columbia. We are highly aware that climate change is reducing salmon returns, and salmon are the basis of Indigenous culture and basis of BC's economy. Ocean acidification affecting aquaculture, again and again, forest fires, elders, the things that particularly are important to BC's coast are being affected already by climate change. And yet the Liberals continue to delay action. We are still based on the same emission reduction targets that the Conservatives put in place. The least this government could have done is commit to deeper cuts and to regulate emission reductions. Simply taxing is not enough. The market solutions haven't got us out of any other social or environmental problem alone. And carbon tax, putting a price on pollution, it doesn't work unless you are ratcheting down emissions and doing that by regulation. My great disappointment that this government has not done that. Neither has it kept its promise to reduce fossil fuel subsidies. Here's a great example of if subsidies were removed from fossil fuels and applied in other sectors, or just we did not tax people for them, we would not be artificially stimulating the fossil fuel industry. And yet the Auditor General has concluded that this government's dragging its feet on that promise. The Minister of Finance has refused to reveal the full list of subsidies. And we've had a number of reports just in this Parliament expressing that concern. The Environment Commissioner for this Parliament again found that 14 departments and agencies had no plan to assess the risks associated with climate change, and even the Minister of Environment and Climate Change did not have a plan in place in her department. How much more internal advice do we have to say this government has got the mandate, it's willing to spend money, it's willing to regulate, it calls itself a climate leader. I wish it would act like a climate leader. I'm strangely longing for the days of Stéphane Dion and Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien. But again, those were Liberal promises, big promises, not fulfilled. This is an ongoing pattern. The New Democrat late beloved leader Jack Layton brought to this House emission reduction legislation that, with a lot of finagling and a few misses, did get the majority of this House of Commons to approve, and to our great heartbreak, it was blocked by the Senate. That could have been legislation that could have sent Canada in a new direction, except for Senate interference. And so what do we have to lean on? In my own riding, I am encouraged by again and again the innovators that are actually taking action on climate change and are creating jobs and making money doing it. Nanaimo's Harmac Pacific Mill has got a waste wood cogen facility that is capturing what used to be old pollution and generating electricity from it. Canadian Electric Vehicles, for 25 years in Nanaimo, has been making electric vehicles, including the Zamboni, yes. Electric bobcats as well. The Nanaimo Aboriginal Centre has just built the first multifamily affordable housing in Nanaimo since the early 90s, and it's done with a passive energy design, something that was developed and innovated in Saskatchewan, but then the government lost appetite for that. It was further developed in Europe, now imported back to Canada, where now the lower income tenants have an 80% saving on their energy bill by virtue of this fantastic passive energy design. Canada's green building sector has $128 billion in gross annual income. It employs more direct full-time workers than forestry, mining, oil and gas combined. And so why on earth this government instead chose to invest $4.5 billion in a leaky old pipeline that risks BC's coast immeasurably and compounds our climate and fossil fuel problem? It is to my great dismay that I urge this whole House to seize the climate emergency as the emergency that it is, and truly be a leader in actions and not only in words.
Bravo. Questions and comments.